When Ruth Calloway's husband walked out in November 1962, her own family didn't take her in. They put her in the barn at the back of the field, her and her 3-week-old baby, in winter, because they were ashamed of her. Her mother had said no, her father had said yes. In 1962, in rural Yorkshire, that was the end of the discussion. What nobody knew, not her father, not the village, not Ruth herself, was that beneath that barn floor was something her grandfather had hidden decades earlier. Something that would prove the farm had never belonged to her father at all. And when her mother found out, she didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply did what she should have done 20 years earlier. Ruth Calloway had grown up on that farm. She knew every stone wall, every muddy path, every field that flooded in February and dried out by April. Her grandfather William had built the farmhouse in the 1920s and left it to her mother Eleanor when he died in 1944. Ruth had grown up knowing this. It was the kind of thing mentioned quietly and then set aside, like many things in that house. Her father George had explained it when Ruth was old enough to ask. The deed existed, yes, but documents like that had no practical weight when a woman was married. The farm passed to the husband by custom, by necessity, by the way things worked. Eleanor had nodded when he said it. She had always nodded. Ruth was the eldest. She had worked the land alongside her father every summer from the age of 9. Her younger brother Thomas had shown no interest in farming. He had moved to Leeds at 18 and came back only for Christmas, always with new clothes and new excuses. None of that seemed to matter when she married Robert Peel in the spring of 1962. Robert was from the next village, charming in the easy way of men who had never been seriously tested. For 7 months, everything seemed fine. Then Ruth became pregnant, and something in Robert shifted. He became quieter, then absent. Then one morning in November, 3 weeks after their daughter Agnes was born, she woke up and he was gone. No note, no word to anyone. The village knew by noon. Her parents called her into the front room that same evening. Her mother spoke first. That was unusual enough that Ruth noticed it immediately. Eleanor said Ruth should stay in the house, that whatever Robert had done was not Ruth's fault, that a mother didn't turn her daughter out in November with a newborn baby regardless of what anyone in the village thought. Her father waited until Eleanor had finished. Then he said, "It isn't that simple." He said the situation was difficult, that people were asking questions, that having Ruth visible in the house was making things hard for the family, for Eleanor at church, for Thomas, who was considering moving back with a girl he was serious about. He said it quietly and reasonably, the way he said most things, wrapped in a tone that made disagreement seem unreasonable rather than necessary. Eleanor looked at her hands. She didn't speak again. Ruth watched her mother fold herself back into silence and understood that the conversation was over. Not because her mother didn't care. Ruth could see that she did, in the way her hands tightened in her lap, in the way she couldn't quite meet Ruth's eyes. But because in that house, in that village, in 1962, a woman's first word on a matter was rarely also her last. Her father said there was the old barn at the back of the south field, dry enough, a wood stove that still worked, just until things settled down. Ruth stood up, picked up Agnes, and walked out the back door without another word. She didn't look at her mother on the way out. She couldn't. She didn't cry until she was halfway across the field and certain nobody could see her. The barn was older than the farmhouse. Her grandfather had built it in the 1910s before the war, when the farm was larger and needed the storage. By 1962 it held rusted equipment, old feed sacks, and a smell of damp wood and earth that never fully left regardless of the season. The wood stove in the corner worked, as her father had said. Ruth spent the first hour finding enough dry wood to get it going, one hand occupied with Agnes the entire time. The floor was stone and earth. There was no furniture except a wooden workbench along one wall and a single chair with a broken back that someone had left there years ago. She made a bed from feed sacks and the blanket she'd brought from the house. She fed Agnes by the light of the stove. Outside, the temperature dropped steadily through the night. She was almost asleep when she heard footsteps on the frozen ground outside. The barn door opened quietly. It was Eleanor. She said nothing at first. She set down what she was carrying, 2 thick wool blankets, a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, a jar of dripping, and 4 eggs wrapped carefully in a cloth. Then she knelt down and tucked one of the blankets around Agnes without being asked. She looked at Ruth for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry." It was all she said. Ruth didn't answer. There was nothing to answer with. Eleanor stood, looked at Agnes one more time, and walked back across the frozen field toward the house. Ruth watched the light in the kitchen window until it went out. She didn't sleep much that night, but she was warm, and in the morning she began to look more carefully at the space around her. That was when she noticed the floor. It wasn't obvious. Ruth had walked across that barn floor her entire childhood without noticing anything unusual. But in the morning light, with Agnes finally asleep on the makeshift bed, she saw it. In the far corner, half hidden beneath an old wooden shelf unit, the stone floor was different. A section roughly 3 feet square where the stones had been laid more carefully than the rest, more deliberately. The edges were too clean, the fit too precise. Someone had put those stones down with intention. She moved the shelf unit to one side. It was heavy, but she managed. Underneath, the section was exactly as she had noticed. A neat square of flat stones set into the earth floor, with the kind of care that suggested whatever was beneath them mattered. She found a rusted iron bar behind the old equipment and used it to work the first stone loose. Then the second. Beneath them was a wooden board. Beneath the board a narrow space dug into the earth, lined with flat stones on all 4 sides, and inside, wrapped in oilskin that had kept out the damp for what looked like decades, a tin box, sealed. Heavy enough to contain something solid. Ruth sat back on her heels and looked at it for a moment. Agnes slept on behind her. She opened the box. Bluxo-5? Inside the tin box were 2 things. The first was a small bundle of banknotes, old but intact, held together with a rubber band that had gone brittle with age. Ruth counted them carefully. £12 in total. Not a fortune, but enough to matter in November 1962 with no income and a newborn. The second was a document, folded twice, wrapped in a separate piece of oilskin, kept dry and intact. Ruth unfolded it carefully at the workbench by the light from the small barn window. It was a deed, handwritten, dated 1931, signed at the bottom by her grandfather William Calloway, and witnessed by 2 names she didn't recognize. It described the farm in precise detail, the fields, the boundaries, the farmhouse, the barn, all of it, and it named the inheritor clearly, not Ruth's father, not Thomas. Her grandfather had written her mother's name, Eleanor Marsh, her maiden name, as the sole inheritor of the property. The farm had passed to Eleanor on William's death in 1944, which meant it had never legally been her father's to inherit, to manage, or to make decisions about. Ruth read it 3 times. Then she sat down on the floor of the barn with the deed in her hands and thought carefully about what this meant. Her father had been running a farm that didn't belong to him for nearly 20 years. He had sent his daughter to sleep in a barn on land that was never his to decide anything about, and her mother had no idea. She didn't go to the farmhouse that morning. She needed to think before she spoke, and she had learned early in life that speaking before thinking around her father never ended well. She spent the day in the barn with Agnes, going over the document again and again. The language was formal and old-fashioned, but the meaning was clear. William Calloway had left the farm explicitly to Eleanor, with a clause stating that the property could not be sold or transferred without her direct written consent. Her father had inherited nothing. He had simply moved into the farmhouse after William died in 1944 and assumed control in the way men of his generation assume control of things, quietly without asking, and with enough confidence that nobody thought to question it. And when Ruth had once asked about the deed as a child, her father had told her it had no legal weight for a married woman. Ruth understood now that this had been a lie. A quiet, deliberate lie told to a woman who had no reason not to believe her own husband. The following morning, Ruth wrapped Agnes tightly against her chest, put the tin box at the bottom of her bag beneath Agnes's spare clothes, and walked 4 miles to the nearest market town. She needed a solicitor. She needed someone to confirm in writing what she already knew was true. She needed to be certain before she walked back into that farmhouse and changed everything. Bloco-7. The solicitor's name was Mr. Harding. He practiced from a narrow office above a hardware shop on the high street, and he looked at Ruth the way people in 1962 often looked at young women who arrived alone with babies and legal questions, with polite skepticism that he made no effort to conceal. She placed the deed on his desk without explanation and waited. He read it once quickly, then again more slowly. He asked where she'd found it. She told him. He asked if her mother was still living. She said yes. He asked if her father knew about the document. She said she didn't think he knew it still existed. Mr. Harding set the deed down and looked at her carefully. He said the document appeared to be a legitimate deed of inheritance, properly witnessed and dated. The farm had passed to Eleanor Calloway on William's death in 1944. Everything her father had decided about the property since then had been decided without legal authority. Ruth asked the question she needed answered directly. She asked whether her mother's marriage affected her ownership, whether a husband had any automatic claim over property his wife had inherited. Mr. Harding said no, not under English law, not since 1882. A married woman could own property in her own name, manage it, and make decisions about it entirely independently of her husband. Whatever Ruth's father had told Eleanor about the deed having no value for a married woman was not true. Ruth sat with that for a moment. Then she asked Mr. Harding to put everything in writing. She had a feeling her mother was going to need to see it clearly before she believed it. She chose her moment carefully. The following afternoon her father drove to the market town for supplies, a trip that always took most of the day. Ruth watched his truck disappear down the lane, then crossed the field to the farmhouse with Agnes on her chest and the tin box under her arm. Her mother was in the kitchen when she walked in. Eleanor looked at the tin box immediately and she recognised it before Ruth had set it on the table. Her expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. Not surprise, something older than surprise. Ruth placed the deed on the table. Then she placed Mr. Harding's written assessment beside it. Eleanor read Mr. Harding's letter first, then the deed. She read both slowly without speaking, her hands flat on the table on either side of the documents as if steadying herself. When she looked up, Ruth asked, "Did you know about the deed?" Eleanor said yes. Her father had shown it to her before he died. He had told her the farm was hers and that she should keep the document safe. She had put it in the tin box herself and hidden it beneath the barn floor because she didn't want George to find it. Ruth asked why she had never said anything. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because your father told me it didn't matter, that a married woman couldn't hold property in her own name, that the document was just your grandfather's way of saying he loved me. I believed him. I had no reason not to." Ruth pointed to Mr. Harding's letter. She said, "He lied to you. It has always been yours. Every decision he has made about this farm for 20 years he made without any legal right to do so." Eleanor read the letter again, this time more slowly. When she set it down, her expression had changed completely. Not anger, not tears, but the particular stillness of a woman who has just understood something she cannot unknow. She looked out the window at the fields her father had built his life around. Then she stood up, untied her apron and placed it on the back of the chair. She said, "I need you to take me to Mr. Harding." They walked into Mr. Harding's office that same afternoon, Eleanor and Ruth side by side, Agnes asleep against Ruth's chest. Mr. Harding looked up from his desk with the expression of a man who had not expected to see them again quite so soon. Eleanor sat down across from him without being invited to and placed the deed on his desk. She said, "I am the legal owner of this property. I would like to know exactly what that means and exactly what I can do with it." Mr. Harding looked at her for a moment. Then he straightened in his chair and began to explain. Eleanor listened without interrupting. She asked 2 questions, both precise, both practical. When Mr. Harding had finished, she asked him to draw up 2 documents. The first formally asserting her ownership of the farm based on William Calloway's deed of 1931. The second appointing Ruth as farm manager with full authority to make decisions about the land and its operation. Mr. Harding said he could have both ready within the week. Eleanor said she would prefer them by Thursday. She signed everything Mr. Harding put in front of her with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had waited a long time to put her name on something that mattered. Ruth sat beside her and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Her mother was doing what she should have been able to do 20 years earlier, and the only thing Ruth could think to do was let her do it without interruption. They were back at the farm before George's truck appeared at the end of the lane. Eleanor went inside, put her apron back on and started dinner. Eleanor told Ruth to bring Agnes inside that same evening, before George returned from town. She carried the blankets herself from the barn and put them back in the linen cupboard without a word. George came in at dusk to find Ruth at the kitchen table feeding Agnes. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at Ruth, then at Eleanor, then back at Ruth. His expression moved through several things in quick succession, before settling into something hard and certain. He said, "She's not staying in this house." Eleanor didn't turn from the stove. She said, "Yes, she is." George said it wasn't Eleanor's decision to make, that he had explained the situation clearly, that having Ruth in the house was exactly what he'd said it was, a problem for the family, for their standing in the village, for Thomas coming back. Eleanor set down the spoon she was holding. She turned around. She said, "This is my house, George. My father left it to me, not to you, to me. Every decision you have made about this property for 20 years you made without any right to do so. Ruth stays. That is my decision, and it is the only decision that has any legal weight in this house." George stared at her. Ruth had never seen anyone look at her mother quite that way before, as if the ground had shifted beneath him, and he was still trying to work out how far he'd fallen. He said, "You don't understand how these things work." Eleanor said, "I understand exactly how they work. Mr. Harding explained it to me very clearly." George sat down heavily in his chair by the fire. He didn't speak again that evening. He didn't touch his dinner. He sat and stared at the fire while Eleanor served the meal, and Ruth fed Agnes, and the kitchen filled with the ordinary sounds of a household continuing without him at its centre. It was the first evening in Ruth's memory that her father had not decided anything at all. Ruth Calloway ran that farm for 31 years. She never remarried. She didn't rule it out exactly. It simply never became necessary in the way she had once assumed it would be. Eleanor lived until 1979. In the years after that evening in the kitchen, she changed in ways that were small but impossible to miss. She spoke first more often. She made decisions about the house without asking. She wrote letters to Thomas herself when she had something to say to him, instead of passing messages through George. Small things, but they added up. George lived on the farm until he died in 1971. He and Ruth were never close again. He worked the land alongside her without complaint. He was not a man who could stop working, but he never again told her what to do with it. He had tried once in the spring of 1963 to reassert something about the rotation of the south field. Eleanor had looked at him from across the kitchen and said nothing. He had not tried again. Thomas came back from Leeds when he heard what had happened, argued with Eleanor for a Sunday afternoon, and left by the evening train. He wrote a letter 2 months later that Ruth read once and put away. She didn't write back. Agnes grew up knowing every stone wall and muddy path the way her mother had. She studied agricultural science in Manchester in the early 1980s and came back to the farm afterward. This surprised people who expected her to leave. It did not surprise Ruth. The tin box stayed on the kitchen shelf for years, empty, the oilskin folded neatly inside it. Ruth kept it not as a reminder of what had been hidden, but of what her grandfather had understood, that some things needed to be set down carefully, kept dry, and trusted to find the right person eventually. The barn floor was repaired in 1967. Ruth had the stones relaid properly, the hollow filled and sealed. There was nothing left to hide down there. She never told the village what had happened. People noticed that things had changed, that Ruth was managing the farm, that George had stepped back, that Eleanor seemed different in some way they couldn't quite name. Nobody asked directly. Ruth didn't offer. Some things don't need an audience to be true. If you liked this story, leave it in the comments. Was it the barn floor, the deed, the moment Eleanor turned around from the stove? Stories like Ruth's don't make the news, but they happen, in farmhouses, in barns, in the quiet moments when someone who has been silent for too long finally decides they have nothing left to lose by speaking. New story every week. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.